All right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, and I think we do have some groups joining on YouTube for the first time today, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And welcome to October. September was a crazy month for us, 53 programs in 16 days. So we really appreciate you taking time in your first few weeks back in this really odd school year to spend with us as we continue to highlight amazing people and places. So last year, we began a partnership with Reach the World, where we got the chance to highlight the MOSAiC expedition, the largest Arctic expedition in history. We have run, I think, 10 or so programs highlighting some amazing people that were on board the ship, some of the cool research that's going on, and more. And I'm pleased today to bring in Matthew Shupe. So he is a research scientist and a co-coordinator of the MOSAiC project. He was on leg one of the expedition, so he's going to share a bit of his own story of being on board the ship and generally what the expedition is all about, what it's trying to accomplish, and where they're at today. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Matt, and take us away.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I'll just say that this is my second time here. I was also here presenting some of this stuff back in earlier this year. So this is kind of the next part of my adventure. I've been doing Arctic adventures for about 20 years. And this MOSAiC thing, which I'll tell you about, has been happening over the last year, and it's really exciting. So again, I'm Matthew Shupe. I'm at the University of Colorado and NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And that's the institution that does the weather forecasting for the United States. And so we're very interested in the weather. We're interested in the Earth system and what's happening. And so the Arctic is a really interesting place for us because of many different factors, but it's changing so much these days that we really need to understand what's happening there. And so my presentation here is further adventures in Arctic research. And back when I last spoke through this Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants concept here, I had just come back from MOSAiC. So MOSAiC is this thing where we took this ship, this icebreaker, and took it out into the central Arctic and froze it into the Arctic sea ice to serve as this base for doing research to understand the sea ice there. And our plan was to leave that ship there for a whole year. And so I was out there starting way last September. So last year at this time of year, I was out there and we went into the Arctic and I stayed there until about December. And this picture is what it looked like when I left. This is in the middle of the day and it's totally dark. That's what happens in the Arctic in the wintertime is it's dark all day long. There's no sun that comes up. You see that little circle in the sky, that's the moon actually overhead above our ship as it's sitting out there in the middle of the Arctic sea ice in the dark. So it was kind of windy and stormy and it was dark all day. These are just a couple pictures of us out on the ice. This is a little research station we have out there, and the bright light in the back is actually the ship. Those are the only lights that we had. This is a picture taken right in the middle of the day, right after lunchtime, where it's totally dark outside. So you can imagine the scene there. Pretty ominous, a little bit eerie at times, but also really fascinating. So that's what I left way back in the wintertime when I left the Arctic and I came back home. But other people came out there and continued the expedition over the course of the year. And so this is a little map of the Arctic looking down on the North Pole. So the North Pole is right here in the middle where the lines cross. And this is the Arctic. All the white area is the area that's covered in ice in the wintertime. And this little colored path is where the ship has drifted. So we started way over here on the red side back in early October of 2019. And we started to drift along. And the ice just kind of flows where it does. And we were just sitting there in the ice and the ice was taking us. And so I was there for this red time period. And then I came home and other people went out there to continue the research. And they were there during this yellow period was another group of people. And then this green part of the curve was a third group of people. And you can see that's a really long time period. That actually happened when this coronavirus started happening all around the world. And it made it difficult for us to exchange the people out there. And so those people that were on board the ship, they were actually kind of stuck out there for a while, 2 months longer than they thought they would be. So they had a long time in the central Arctic. And also, the ice drifted very quickly across the Arctic. And so it pushed the ship and the ice way across the Arctic. And with this whole coronavirus thing setting in and all these changes happening, I really wanted to get back out there and really make sure that we could keep doing our research. And so myself and a group of other people took another ship out to meet this icebreaker that was frozen in the ice and to exchange our people. And so I, again, was back on the ship when it turned into this blue color here. And that was at about in kind of early June when we did that exchange. And then we drifted with the ice for another couple of months until the ship and the ice drifted all the way out to the edge of where the ice is. And it started to melt and break up and fall away. And at that point, we exchanged people. And that's when I came home. And some more people came out who are still out there now. And they took the ship and they went back way near the North Pole and they drifted for a little while. And now, actually, they are just coming home. They'll be home in a few days now. So this is our whole year in the Arctic. This is MOSAiC, our expedition out there into the Arctic. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my experience then on the summertime, this little summer mission color-coded in blue here. So one of the most distinctive things about the summertime in the Arctic, and one thing that really is different from the wintertime, is the sun, right? In the wintertime, it's dark all day long, 24 hours of darkness. But in the summertime, it's light all 24 hours. The sun just circles around the sky. And so this is a really remarkable feature of the Arctic system, and an important one, of course. That sun also does a few other things. Well, one thing is it really activates the biology, right? There's all kinds of little critters and algae that live in the ocean, that live in the ice. And when there's sunlight, oh, they really start to become happy and to really produce a lot of energy and really become active. So biology gets activated. And I think that there's been some presentations on Arctic biology here. Another important thing is that it starts to warm up, right? The summertime is warmer than the wintertime. Turns out that the temperatures that we experienced out there are at right about the melting point of ice, because the ice is actually melting. And so that's at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. So that might seem a little bit cold to us. That's kind of like a wintertime temperature for most of us. But in the Arctic, that's a summertime temperature, and that's really warm. And another really important thing, and I kind of mentioned it already, is this notion of melt. That's what's happening in the Arctic in the summer, is the ice is melting. And that is one of the really important things that we're there to study, to understand the ice. So here's a picture from a helicopter looking down on the scene where we were parked in the ice. You can see our ship there, and you can see an ice floe. This big kind of circular thing is one big chunk of ice that we parked our ship next to, and we used that chunk of ice as our platform for studying what's happening in the Arctic. In the picture, there's a couple little dots you can see. These are different installations on the ice, and you'll see some slides about those things later. But one of the really cool things and important things are these blue patches. These look kind of like lakes, and indeed they are lakes. They're melt ponds. This is what happens in the Arctic on the sea ice in the summertime when the snow and the ice all start to melt. That water kind of comes together and forms these ponds. So you can see ponds all over the place. Here's another great view of our ice floe. This is taken from a camera looking down from a balloon that was way overhead. And so you can see the ship down there. You can actually see another big balloon that was flying, this little orange one. And you can see our ice floe with this really interesting texture of different kind of melted areas and cracks in the ice and all kinds of other things. So the sea ice, that's really why we were out there for MOSAiC. We're going there to study the sea ice. And why would we want to do that? Well, I'm going to show you a couple of plots. And this is actually data. This is what we're out there to really try to understand with our measurements. So what I'm showing in this plot here is data that's from models that are predicting what's going to happen to the sea ice. And on the plot, we see a time scale here, a time axis on the bottom that goes from 1900, so that's 120 years ago, all the way through the year 2000, past the year 2020, where we are right now, and all the way into the future, into the year 2100. So that's 80 years into the future. And these models can predict what's happening with the ice over that time. And so all these different colored lines and squiggles are what our models say are going to happen to the September sea ice extent. So this is how spatially extensive the sea ice is in September. That's at the very end of the melt season, when it has shrunk as small as it will be before it starts growing again in the winter. And you see in this plot that all these different squiggly lines, the different models disagree a little bit, but they all kind of agree that the ice is going away, right? This is going to happen in the coming decades. The ice is going away. And up in the upper right-hand corner, this is actually a map of the Arctic and the sea ice extent from 2 weeks ago. On September 15th, the white little area is the extent of the sea ice in the Arctic on September 15th. At that time of year, it probably should be more like what this orange curve is like. At least in the past, that's what it was like. So you can see that there are huge areas that are blue now where there's open ocean where there used to be ice. So the Arctic sea ice is in decline. It's changing a lot, and this is a really important thing for us. Another plot that's pretty interesting is what happens over the year in the sea ice, how extensive that sea ice is. And this plot kind of shows that. So on the bottom axis, it's showing the whole year. So January, February, March, all months of the year. And the curves show you how much sea ice there is. And you can see that here at the lowest part, that's the end of summer, and the ice starts to grow again as it gets cold and going into the wintertime. And here we are starting at the beginning of the plot again in the wintertime. And then eventually, as we get into spring, it starts to warm up again. And then the ice starts to decline again. And there's less of that. And that's the ice melt season. And that's what we were there measuring when I was there last. One other really important thing is the red curve is the record minimum in September, right here. And that was from 2012. So that was about 8 years ago. That was the time when we had the least sea ice in the Arctic that we ever have observed. And this year, 2020, is in blue. We were really close to a record, and this was the second lowest year ever. So it was pretty remarkable that MOSAiC was out there at this time of year to measure this really crazy year where we have very little sea ice. So our main question for MOSAiC is, why is the sea ice declining, and how does that affect other parts of the Earth's system? So that's really what's motivated us to go out into the Arctic and to look at the Arctic system. I want to give you one more little science lesson here, and it's a lesson about feedbacks. And this is a really important detail about the Arctic system and why we're seeing so much change there. So I think we've all heard that the Earth is warming, right? The temperature of the Earth warms because there's emission of what's called greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These are things like carbon dioxide. And those gases trap heat. They're like a blanket. They trap the Earth's heat and they make the Earth warm up. So the Earth is warming, and well, it stands to reason then that the Arctic will also warm because the Earth is warming. And we all know that as you warm things up, well, there will be more ice melt, right? So if you get warmer temperatures, the ice will melt more. Okay, so that makes sense. And you can see in this picture here, it's a picture in the back there of ice and of open ocean. So the ocean parts are really dark and the ice parts are really white. And the ice parts that are really white reflect a lot of sunlight back to space, while the ocean parts that are really dark, they absorb a lot of sunlight. And so as there's more ice melting, that means there's more open ocean to absorb sunlight and absorb more energy at the surface, which then makes the Arctic system warm up even more. And as it warms more, it melts more ice. And then as it melts more ice, there's more open ocean that can absorb more sunlight. and so on and so on and so on. It's this cycle, it's this feedback that really causes the Arctic to change very rapidly. And this is called the ice albedo feedback. It's one of the most important things happening in the Arctic right now. And it's a reason that the Arctic is changing more rapidly than other parts of the globe. So this is one of the things we're there to study. So how do we study the ice and everything else that's related to the ice? So here we go on a little picture tour of some of our typical activities out at MOSAiC. Well, to study the ice, you actually have to go and be on the ice. And so we would walk out on the ice pretty much every day. We'd go out there and make all kinds of measurements, carry our equipment, and go do little explorations on the ice. Even on days when it was really foggy out. This is a great picture. You can see the ship back in the fog in the distance and all kinds of people out there moving their gear around and conducting their research. We would have to put lots of equipment out on the ice. This is actually a sled that contains a lot of instruments that came from one of my teams that we built here in Colorado when we took out there to the ice. Here it is installed out on the ice. And this is a sled that measures the energy transfer from the atmosphere to the sea ice. We're quantifying how much sunlight reaches the ice, or how much do the winds blow warm air to the ice, things like that. And you would imagine that if you're understanding or trying to understand what's happening to the sea ice and why it's melting, that you'd want to understand the transfer of heat to the sea ice from the atmosphere. So that's one of our important goals. We also set up things like towers out on the ice to tell us, what are the temperatures and the moistures like in the lower atmosphere. And I show an arrow here pointing to this little device here. This is actually a sensor that sounds like a bird. It makes a sound. It goes, and that sound actually tells us about the winds. We want to know about the winds and how they're blowing the ice and how they're blowing warm air in. We also fly balloons, really, really big balloons. You can see this balloon. There's a couple pictures of it flying overhead. And some of my colleagues there are putting different sensors, different instruments on this tether that holds the balloon. And then it goes way, way, way up into the sky and measures all kinds of properties of the atmosphere and the clouds and everything that's happening above the sea ice. We also fly remote control airplanes, drones. You can tell these people are having fun. They get to fly airplanes every day. Wow, that would be a great job. And sometimes, like in this case, oops, they landed in a melt pond. But they really had a great time out there flying these airplanes around every day. In the background of this picture, you can see the drone people. That's where they're sitting to fly their airplanes. And they're measuring the temperatures in the atmosphere, so above the ice. And in the foreground is another picture of another group of people at another tent there. And they are actually operating a winch that lowers an instrument package down into the ocean below the ice. And they're measuring the temperature of the ocean. And you can imagine that we'd want to understand the temperature of the atmosphere and the ocean if we're going to understand what's happening to the sea ice, which sits right in between those two. For more measurements in the ocean, we have the Beast, and that's this contraption. It looks pretty crazy with all kinds of little gadgets on it. And this is a vehicle that goes down into the water through a hole that we've cut in the ice. And here it is drifting along under the ice in the water. And wow, that's green down there. This is what it looks like when there's all kinds of biological activity happening in the summertime in the Arctic. So it's very green water. Now, of course, if you're interested in the sea ice, you have to go out and measure the sea ice itself. And one great question that we always have is, how thick is the sea ice? Well, let's find out. Let's drill some holes. We did this all over the place to really understand the thickness of the ice. And the answer is, it was mostly about 2 to 8 feet thick. And that really depended on where you were on the ice floe, if the ice had pushed together to form ridges, or if it was melting. So there's a lot of variability across the ice floe. And sometimes it looks like these people are doing about the same thing, but what they're doing is they're taking an ice core. And so an ice core is this kind of tube of ice. Here's a picture of one. That's a section all the way through the ice, so you can look at what's happening in the ice. And this is really important for understanding, for example, the salt content of the ice, because the ocean is salty water, and so the ice has salt in it, or gases that are trapped in the ice, or algae or other critters that live there. So many properties that we can learn about the ice by taking cores of the ice. So there were so many of these cores taken every week. There were, multiple tens of cores taken for different purposes. And how about those melt ponds, right? We saw those before. The melt water that accumulates on the surface. Well, we definitely need to know how much water is there. What is that water doing? How deep is it? This person is probing the depth of some of these things, and she's wearing a survival suit. So if she falls in the water, she's safe. These suits float and they help to keep somebody warm in the case that they fall in the water. Here's a guy that's measuring the reflection of light from the surface. This is an important part of that ice albedo feedback that I told you about. We need to understand, how does sunlight reflect off of different surface types? Off of the ice, off of melt ponds, off of the open ocean water. And so people were measuring all across the ice sheet the reflectance of the sunlight to try to measure how much reflectance there is. And what about the snow? The snow falls in wintertime and it melts in summertime, and it serves a really interesting role in that it's kind of an insulation blanket over the sea ice, but it has all kinds of interesting properties that will determine how it behaves. And so this scientist is exploring the snow, and I imagine she's a little cold there with the short sleeves on. And here she is with a warmer suit on, with some fancy contraption that's measuring some of the properties of the snow. She wants to look at things like the density of snow, or air pockets in the snow, or how big are the snow crystals, things like that, so she can really understand how that snow behaves and what role it's serving in its interaction with the sea ice. The ice, wow, it was so fascinating out there. It has so many different shapes and forms. I was just blown away almost every day by the kinds of things that we would see. And so here's a couple pictures about some of the different kinds of ice that we saw out there in my recent trip. Here's just a great picture of some, these blues that are happening with the sun reflecting through the ice. Very cool. Here's some reflection off of open water with these big blocks of ice. These are kind of rounded. This is what they look like as they're all melting. This is, I call this one the flying saucer. I don't even know how this happened, but it looks like this little chunk of ice is hovering above the water somehow by itself. Really amazing. And this is a picture from the side of a block of ice that was pushed up to the surface. And you can kind of see that on the bottom, it has all these really kind of strange channels and texture to it. And that actually is what happens to the sea ice when the salt content that's in the ice drains out of it. So that ice forms initially from salty ocean water, and then eventually that salt is rejected. And so slowly the salt drifts down through the ice and gets rejected from the ice through these kind of channels. So you get these really interesting formations in the ice. There's also lots of really cool crystal structures. I call these ones the shards, just little shards of ice that we found on the surface that look really interesting. And sometimes they're really big. So all kinds of different shards. And, there was some ice that I called the jewels. It seemed like you'd pick up a pile of them. It was like you were handling this huge handful of jewels, like in a pirate's treasure chest or something. So many different types of ice out there. This one looked to me like a forest of trees with little rivers draining through it. And one other thing that was really interesting about the melting ice is it was actually really dirty. You can see here little pockets of dirt embedded in the ice, and this is called sediment. And this tells us something about where the ice came from. Turns out that this ice flow initially came from Russia. It came from the Siberian part of Russia and right near the coast. And so it's there forming right where there's shallow water, and it could pull a lot of dirt and other things from the ocean floor into it while it was freezing. And then it drifted across the Arctic, and we found it and we started studying it. And here's a cool picture of my Siberian treasures. These are the kinds of things that I found in the ice. They were just melting out. Little rocks, little shells, starfish, little plants, all kinds of things were melting out of the ice, and we would collect them every day and to see, what kind of treasures would we find today when we're walking out on the ice. And here's a picture taken from a helicopter, just so you can see some of the different kinds of ice around. You can see all kinds of dirty pieces of ice. So lots of this ice came from the area where it was picking up a lot of the sediment. So how do we move around out there on the ice, other than with our own 2 feet, which definitely happened a lot? Well, I just showed you a picture from a helicopter. We definitely used helicopters a lot. Helicopters are important for moving around in this kind of challenging surface that has water and ice and different mixtures. We had to transport equipment around. And so this is a picture of one of the sleds that's from my team. We were flying it out to another station. And so we use helicopters to do some of our work. Here's a great picture of some colleagues that are out on some kayaks. We had to use kayaks to go and sample the ocean water, or maybe we needed to go to that ice that was on the other side of the water. So these kayaks would come in really handy. And again, these ladies are all wearing survival suits. So if they happen to fall in, they'd still be pretty safe. Snowmobiles are very important. We would pull sleds behind with all of our cargo, all our gear and instruments on there to move them all around the ice. But you can imagine with these melt ponds forming, that is really a challenge. So we had to build lots of bridges so that we could get around on the ice and move our equipment there. And we had this big tractor thing, the Argo, for hauling our bigger loads. So this was on special occasions when we had to move things like this little building. So lots of different modes of transportation out there on the sea ice to get us out to our research stations, to move our equipment around, and to help us do the kind of work that we needed to do on a daily basis. And I don't know what this mode of transportation is. I think they were just having a little bit of fun with some floaty devices. It was a lot of fun out there. And lastly, for my presentation, what about the animals? People always ask about what animals did you see out in the Arctic? And so I'll give just a couple pictures here of a couple of the animals. These animals are some of the small ones. So this is a view under a microscope of copepods, little teeny guys that swim around in the ocean. There's lots of these around, and they're really important because they are the food for bigger things like fish. There are some people out there fishing, catching different types of fish and trying to understand the kind of fish that live in the Arctic Ocean. So we caught quite a few fish out there. This is one of the bigger ones. I'm just really amazed at how big those eyes are. And the things that eat the fish are seals. We saw a lot of seals that were curious about the work we were doing. And of course, who eats the seals? Well, the polar bears. We had polar bears visit us, very, very often, and they would interrupt our work. At one period, they came pretty much every day for a whole week. Lots of polar bears around, including this cute little one. Oh, they were just adorable at times. Really fascinating to see polar bears. So my presentation is coming to an end. I just want to say that MOSAiC was really an amazing adventure. It was so cool to see the different seasons, the winter and the summer. It was so cool to work with other scientific colleagues from all around the world, from 20 different countries, and all kinds of different scientific disciplines, looking at biology and chemistry and physics. It was really an amazing experience. And I'll say that the Arctic is going to continue to change, and we need more scientists there. And some of you all someday might be great scientists. We're going to need you to come and understand the Arctic as it evolves in the future. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I will be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was awesome. If you want to end screen share so you can see us again, have a bit of a conversation, you're welcome to do that. Miss Beccaro, I'm going to come to you for questions in a minute. We had a few classes that had some weird tests and COVID stuff today, so we had more that were supposed to join, and unfortunately, it's just weird times for a lot of our teachers, but they did pass along some questions. So I want to start with one for you, Matthew, which is, how did you choose members of the trip? You talked about 20 countries all over the world. How did people end up on this sort of most elite of Arctic expeditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of it is based on meetings that we have beforehand. We've been having meetings about this mission for more than 10 years. And these are international meetings at different locations around the world where we bring people together to talk about our ideas, to refine our plans, and to help kind of pull in and broaden the community. And we've intentionally reached out to different communities because we knew that we can't just go there to study the sea ice, or we can't just go there to study the atmosphere, but we have to study all these different pieces. And so we've, in some cases, intentionally reached out to different communities to invite them to be part of this. And in other cases, different communities heard about MOSAiC and they said, hey, I want to be involved in that. And so over time, the community just continued to grow and grow and grow. And now, wow, we have so many people involved. We had more than 400 people that went to the field. And back home, we probably have 1,000 people that are involved in different aspects of supporting this mission and conducting the research in different capacities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. A couple quick notes too before we go to Ms. Baquero. If you're joining us on YouTube, please share where you're joining from around the world. We'd love to see your questions, and I'll take as many as I can. And I also want to stress that in all the presentations on MOSAiC, I've never seen such beautiful photos, so thank you for that, Matthew. Some really, really eerie, cool shots, so that was particularly fantastic. I want to bring in Ms. Baquero, joining us in Yucatan and Merida in Mexico. So welcome in, Ms. Baquero. If you have a question, go for it.
Okay, well, I really have a lot of questions, but well, there's a lot of them, so I don't know if we have time for all of them. But one of them that struck me the most is oh, I lost it. Okay, what will happen if the ice melts completely, and how can we help to stop this?
Great question.
Wow. Well, we are trying to understand what will happen if the ice melts completely. One of the things is related to what I mentioned there in the presentation, the ice albedo feedback, is that without any ice there, the open ocean will absorb a lot of sunlight, and that will continue to heat the Arctic and continue to make it hard for the ice to grow back. And so that's a really important property of the Arctic system. And that might have effects on things like the weather that we experience at lower latitudes, right? If the Arctic keeps warming so fast, it'll change the large-scale circulation of our globe that would affect our weather. So that's a really important concept. Now, as for what we could do to change that, that's another great question. It's one that, I don't study very directly myself. That's kind of called a mitigation. And while there are many things that we could do individually, of course, if we want to stop this change from happening, the important thing is greenhouse gases, right? That's really the driving force behind all of this change in the Arctic and in the globe. And so we need to think about how we interact with greenhouse gases. And that's things like, what kinds of cars do we drive? How do we heat our houses? What kind of industries do we support? And things like that. And so those are some of the easy ways that we can kind of think about our own lives in the context of this changing Arctic system.
Yep. Fantastic. It's such a complicated issue, and it's one with climate change where it's going to require all hands on deck effort from around the world, but there are some simple solutions. We love highlighting those in this program, and I really like that very poignant question to kick us off. So thanks, Ms. Baquero, and I will come back for a few more. I want to share another one from one of our teachers that sent it in on email. How do you get there? So you talk about getting to this ship and going on these trips. So what does that actually look like from where you're starting now to end up on the ship? What's the process?
Yeah, well, the process now is a little more complicated than it was in the past. And this is because of the COVID situation right now. So for me to get out there for my last part, I had to go to Germany and be in quarantine in Germany for a couple of weeks to make sure that nobody that was going to get on board had the coronavirus. And then we got on board a couple of ships in Germany and sailed up into the Arctic. And we waited there. And the ship that was frozen in the ice came to meet us, and we exchanged crew and some cargo and some food and some fuel. And then we sailed back into the ice and found our parking space again and continued the mission. So it took quite a number of weeks to implement that whole process, of course. And then the way back was basically the same thing, but I was on the other side of it. So another ship came out all the way out into the ice, and we did the exchange. And then it took us a couple of weeks to get back. So it's at a very minimum 2 weeks to get either way. But now with the coronavirus situation, it takes a couple of extra weeks because we need to do quarantines as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. All right, Ms. Baquero, come on back in if you have another question for us, and I know you do. take us away.
Oh, yes. Okay. One of them is, what is the most dangerous thing you can encounter there in the North Pole?
Yeah.
The most dangerous thing. Oh boy. There are, I guess, a number of dangers. I mean, some are the environment itself, right? In the wintertime, especially, it's very cold. It's minus 40 degrees, which happens to be the same Celsius and Fahrenheit. Minus 40 degrees is very cold. And of course, there's the threat of frostbite and things like that. So that's one danger. The ice itself can be a little dangerous. It can crack, it can move, it can come together. So that's also a little dangerous. And of course, the polar bears, right? The polar bears are out there. Mostly they're curious. You know, they don't usually look for humans. Humans aren't part of their diet. But, you know, they could be dangerous under certain circumstances. And so that's something that we certainly planned for very much. And we had a lot of awareness about bears. We had bear guards. So we'd be out on the ice doing our work, and we'd always have somebody that was being the bear guard. And they were guarding the humans, but they were also guarding the bears because, you know, in the end, we just don't want conflicts between bears and humans because probably it would end up really badly for the bears. And we don't want to hurt any bears. They're out there. They're such an important part of the ecosystem. So they can be dangerous, but, you know, really, they're just these beautiful creatures that are really kind of a fundamental part of the Arctic system. And so we try to kind of minimize that danger.
Yeah. You are so passionate about all this. I love it. Thanks so much for all these fantastic answers. And by the way, if anyone is keen on polar bear guards, on October 5th, so next week, we're having Laura Schmidt on, all joining us all the way in southern Germany. And she's going to talk about her own experiences helping protect people from the apex predator of the planet. I want to share another question, which we've had before with regards to MOSAiC, and I love it whenever we get it, is how expensive was this expedition? How expensive is it to bring this together to fruition, get the ship, bring people there? And why is that, like, as a follow-up to that, how can we justify that? Why is it so important that we're spending this money for this sort of work?
That is a great question as well. And it's one that is actually a little bit hard to quantify. Right now, we say that this whole expedition cost about $150 million. This is contributions from 20 different nations. And sometimes it's hard to quantify because a lot of the investment actually happens back at home, right? We've paid a lot of money to go to the Arctic and to make these measurements, but then back at home, we have to actually take the data, and over the next 5 to 10 years, we actually have to do a lot of research. So that's also a really important investment in MOSAiC, is to invest in the research so that we can gain the knowledge out of all these measurements that we've made in the Arctic system. So the overall budgetary impact, right, the overall cost is still growing in time. So we're at least $150 million, and it'll get bigger from there. Now, justifying this. Yes, the justification, in my mind, it's really very easy. We have a changing Earth system, and that affects everybody. All the people all around the Earth. The changing Earth system will affect them in some way or another, whether that's through the weather, whether that's through drought patterns that change our food production, whether that's through changes in the ecosystem that affect the fisheries and our ability to catch fish, or things like sea level change. As the Arctic ice is melting, not the sea ice, but say the Greenland Ice Sheet or the Antarctic Ice Sheet, as those melt, which are also both in the polar regions, well, that contributes to sea level rise, and that could affect all kinds of people that live on coastlines. And so these are really important issues for humankind, and things that we definitely need to understand. We need to know about these, and we need to importantly know what's going to happen in the future. We need to create models that are going to help us to understand what's going to happen for our children and our grandchildren and future generations of the Earth, so that we can plan accordingly. These are all super important, and therefore very much worth our investment in doing this kind of science.
That was a beautiful answer. We did highlight that question with a lot of NASA researchers as well. And I always like to highlight here that most countries in the world are at about 1.5 to 2% of their sort of major budget for everything that they do that goes towards research and development. So there's, that can come up with numbers like $150 million or billions of dollars for projects, but in the scheme of things, it's so little and it can contribute to so much of understanding the world around us and making sure that we have solutions for future problems all in one go. So that was a beautiful answer, and I would give you money for that answer. So I'm glad that it led to such a fantastic expedition. It's been such a thrill getting to highlight it. We'll ask 2 more questions. I'll go to Ms. Becerra again in a minute. Another one we just got online is day by day for you. So you highlighted so much of what so many different people were doing on the ship. For you personally, when you're on board the expedition, what are you doing on a day by day basis? Is it the same thing? Is it different things? Is it helping other people? What's going on?
Yes, well, I'm one of the leaders, and so I definitely help a lot of people. That's one of my important goals there every day, is to make sure that the other scientists have what they need to conduct their research. That's a really important part of being a leader out in the field. But in general, day to day, wow, each day was really exhausting. I'll say that much. We were working very hard and very long days. And as you can recall, the sun just circled the sky. So, hey, it never seems like it's night. But a typical day would be getting up and having breakfast and having some meetings, because we always need to have meetings to plan what's going to happen for the day. You never quite know what the conditions will be. And then we'll go out to the ice. We need to go out to the ice to check on some instruments, to make some adjustments, to maybe install some new instruments. And then at some point in the middle of the day, we'll come back and have a little bit of lunch on board the ship. And then in the afternoon, typically it's back out on the ice. It's go to transect around the ice floe, or to make some ice cores, or maybe to take a helicopter and fly out to one of our remote stations, things like that. And then back on board again, just in time for dinner. And after dinner, we've got a couple of typical meetings. We have a meeting of all the scientists every day, just to make sure everybody is aware of what's happening, aware of all the changes, the dangers that might be happening, or what the plans are for the coming days. And then we'll typically have some leadership meetings. And then at the last part of the day, well, maybe I get a chance to look at some of my data to make sure that looks good, or to make sure it's archived so that we don't lose any of it. And boy, if I'm really lucky, there's some chance for some social time, or some exercise, or a little bit of relaxation. But there wasn't a whole lot of time for that. So that was a typical day out there on the ice floe.
We just had joining us on YouTube the Young family, who I think joined us for like 50 broadcasts over the last year. We love whenever they can tune in. And so their question always is, what is your favorite part of your job? So you just got to highlight all the variety of what it is. Is there something that really makes you get out of bed in the morning and drive you to do all this?
Wow, there are a number of things that are my favorites. I would say, though, that going to the field is definitely a big part of it. Usually, I'm back at home in the office, and I'm sitting at computers, and I'm doing data analysis, and that's all good as well. But going to the field is really exciting. And in particular for MOSAiC, the part that I found so exciting was that we had this amazing international group of people out there working together. We were all collaborating together. It really didn't matter what country people were from. We all worked together so well to support each other, and to do the science that we all agree is the important science. And so to me, that was something that was very motivating. And I guess one more part of it, as we think about the diversity of it, is I was also really motivated by the different ages of scientists. We had a lot of very young scientists, all the way up to the older scientists. And we had a lot of scientists in different disciplines. So studying all kinds of different topics, all working together. And those are some pretty unique things about this expedition in particular. And so it was really motivating to be there doing research right next to somebody who's a biologist, because I'm a person that studies the atmosphere and clouds. And so we can work together in ways that we typically don't work together. So to me, that's actually an opportunity to learn a lot more about what's happening in the Arctic system. So I was pretty motivated by that.
That is a special experience, and what a great answer. Let's wrap up with one more from Ms. Becerra's class. Come on back in, guys, and end us off. 45 minutes flies by. Fun.
Wow, I have like 10 questions, but I guess I'm only reduced to one. So, have you ever found like anything, like any cool things or creatures underwater?
Yeah. Wow. So the underwater environment, I'm not an oceanographer, so I'm usually looking in the atmosphere, but I definitely was looking down when I was out there quite a bit. And it was actually really fascinating. So one thing that happens right? The ocean is salty, right? It's salt water. We know this. But the snow that falls is not salty. And so as it starts to melt, that's a lot of fresh water that then drains into the ocean. And so we actually had this really fascinating situation where there's the salty ocean, and above that is this fresh layer of water. And I don't know if people have ever experienced this before. I actually experienced it in Mexico once, where you see this interface between those. But it really changes how things look under the water. In the fresh water, it's really clean. And then you look down in the salty water and it's a little more cloudy. And there's this really interesting interface between those. And right at that interface, there actually was all kinds of biological activity and other things happening. And so to me, that was just a really amazing thing to experience there, to see that. Now, of course, the experience was a little bit of a virtual experience because we'd stick cameras down there and other devices, but it was still this really amazing and beautiful scene. And another cool thing about there, underneath the ice, is looking at the bottom side of the ice, right? So ice that's sitting in water, about 10% of that is what we see above the surface, and 90% is below. And so on the top side, you see these little mountains where ice is pushed together. Those are called pressure ridges. And so you can imagine underneath the ice, there are huge mountains pointing down that we can't see from above unless you're down there with some fancy device and some fancy camera. And then you see all these really crazy blocks of ice and kind of gnarly features underneath the ice. And so these are the kind of things that are down there hidden below the surface that are really one of the exciting things to experience.
Sold. I'm going to the Arctic. This is such a cool story. And I want to recommend to our classes too, if any of you have ever had the chance to check out Blue Planet 2 from the BBC, they have an amazing deep sea episode where they show where it's salt water and then even saltier water. And it looks like a lake under the ocean. And it's incredible. And some of the life at the interface there is amazing as a nice follow-up to that. So Blue Planet 2. Ms. Beccaro, I will please save your questions. I'd love to take more of them later, and it's fine if we can get you those answers. But I want to highlight two things for students that might be joining in. MOSAicexpedition.org. You can find it about the whole trip, all sorts of cool stuff, great educational resources. So check that out in the banner on the bottom. And Reach the World's page for the MOSAiC expedition. So Reach the World, again, a big partner of ours. We've been highlighting the MOSAiC expedition because of their partnership over the last year. So I really encourage you to check that out, and there'll be many more opportunities to get some great answers to your questions. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you joining, and thanks for fantastic stories. What a great time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, I'll bring in Ms. Beccaro if you want to join me in saying a big thank you and